Imagine waking up one day as the most powerful country on Earth. Your military is unbeatable. Your economy is the engine of the entire world. Other nations come to you, hats in hand, asking for favor. You set the rules. You decide who wins and who loses. Now imagine that within a generation or two, all of that is gone. Your armies are humiliated. Your economy is a wreck. The countries that once feared you now barely notice you exist. Sound impossible? It's not. It's happened over and over again throughout history. And the scary part is, it always follows the same pattern. Today we're going to look at the countries that had it all and lost it. Not just lost a war or had a bad decade, lost everything. The wealth, the dominance, the global respect. Gone, and we're going to ask the question that nobody in power ever wants to answer. How does the mightiest fall?
Let's start with Macedonia, because this might be the fastest superpower collapse in all of human history. Alexander the Great spent 13 years building an empire that stretched from Greece all the way to the edges of modern-day India. He never lost a single battle, not one. His empire covered roughly 2 million square miles. He controlled the trade routes between East and West. He had the wealth of Persia, Egypt, and Babylon all flowing into his treasury. At the peak of Macedonian power, there was genuinely no force on earth that could challenge it. Then Alexander died at 32, probably from fever, possibly from poisoned wine, nobody knows for sure. And within about 40 years, that empire had shattered into pieces that would never be reunited. Why? Alexander had no clear successor. He had a mentally incapacitated half-brother and an infant son. Neither could actually rule. So his generals, men called the Diadochi, meaning the successors, immediately started fighting each other. These were the most talented military minds of the ancient world, and instead of maintaining the empire together, they tore it apart, trying to grab pieces for themselves. By 275 BC, the Macedonian Empire had fractured into 3 separate kingdoms, each one claiming to be the true heir of Alexander. None of them ever came close to his power. The lesson here is brutal and simple. An empire built entirely around one person's genius has no future beyond that person. Alexander built an incredible machine, but forgot to build the institutions that would outlast him. The moment he was gone, the machine ate itself.
Now let's talk about Portugal. Portugal's story is extraordinary and almost nobody knows it. At its peak in the early 1500s, Portugal controlled an empire that circled the entire globe. A country with fewer than 2 million people controlled trade routes from Brazil to Africa to India to Japan. They were the first Europeans to reach India by sea. For a brief window, Lisbon was the wealthiest city in Europe. Portuguese ships were everywhere. Their language became a trade language across 3 continents. So how did a country of under 2 million people end up losing the most impressive global network any European power had ever built? The answer comes down to one word: overstretch. Portugal simply didn't have the population to maintain what it had built. Governing an empire scattered across Brazil, Africa, India, Southeast Asia, and Japan requires enormous numbers of administrators, soldiers, and sailors.
Portugal kept running out of men. Every voyage, every garrison, every colonial outpost was draining the same tiny population pool. Then, in 1578, King Sebastian I led a catastrophic crusade into Morocco. At the Battle of Alcazar, the Portuguese army was wiped out. The king died. Much of the Portuguese nobility died with him. The country was left without a king, without an army, and without a ruling class. 2 years later, Spain annexed Portugal entirely.
For 60 years, Portugal was ruled by the Spanish crown. That was the end of Portugal's independent superpower status. When they finally broke free from Spain in 1640, the world had moved on. The Dutch and English had taken over their trade routes. The empire survived in fragments, but the dominance was gone permanently. Now we have to talk about the Soviet Union, because this is the most recent and in many ways the most dramatic superpower collapse in modern history. And it happened with breathtaking speed. The Soviet Union in 1980 was, by any measure, a superpower. It had the world's largest conventional army. It had nuclear weapons capable of destroying the planet several times over. It controlled Eastern Europe as a buffer zone. It had client states across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. It was one of only 2 poles around which the entire world order revolved. Then in 1991, it ceased to exist, just gone. 15 separate countries where one superpower used to be. What happened? The economy was the foundation of everything, and the Soviet economy was fundamentally broken. The central planning system directing all production from Moscow was increasingly unable to function in a modern world. Soviet factories were producing massive quantities of goods nobody wanted. Agricultural productivity was a disaster. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union was actually importing grain from the United States just to feed its own people. Think about that. A country claiming to be a superior economic system was buying food from its main ideological enemy because it couldn't grow enough itself. The military spending was crushing everything else. At the peak of the Cold War, the Soviet Union was spending somewhere between 15 and 20% of its entire economy on the military. The United States, by comparison, was spending around 6%. The Soviets were trying to match American military capability with an economy roughly half the size. The math was never going to work. Then came Afghanistan. In 1979, Soviet forces invaded, expecting a quick, clean victory. What they got was a decade-long nightmare that killed around 15,000 Soviet soldiers and cost billions of rubles the economy could not afford. The Afghans, armed partly by American weapons, turned the conflict into a brutal war of attrition that Soviet forces could never win. By the time Gorbachev came to power in 1985 and started his reform programs, it was already too late. Opening up the system revealed just how bad things were, and loosening political control allowed nationalist movements across the Soviet republics to demand independence. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev resigned. The Soviet flag over the Kremlin came down, and the largest country on Earth by territory simply stopped existing as a unified state. So you've seen it happen to Macedonia, to Portugal, to the Soviet Union, and to Persia, Spain, Britain, France, and the Ottomans. Different eras, different continents, different cultures. But the same story keeps repeating. So what is actually going on? What is the real pattern underneath all of this? The first thing every fallen superpower has in common is that they confused current strength with permanent strength. Every single one of them genuinely believed their dominance was a natural state of affairs rather than a temporary position in a constantly shifting world. Persia thought nobody could challenge them. Spain thought unlimited silver meant unlimited power. The Soviets thought ideology and military might could substitute for economic health. None of them were right. The second pattern is that size becomes a trap. There is a critical point in every empire's growth where the cost of maintaining what you have starts to exceed the benefits of having it. Every new territory requires soldiers to garrison it, administrators to govern it, ships to connect it. Portugal is the clearest example. A 2 million person country trying to run a global empire was always going to collapse under its own weight. The third pattern is the failure to adapt. Every superpower that fell did so partly because the world changed and they didn't. Persia's military tactics froze while Alexander innovated. The Ottomans watched European armies modernize while their own stagnated. The Soviet Union clung to central planning while market economies ran circles around them. Being the best at something that no longer matters is not a competitive advantage. The fourth pattern is that internal problems kill empires more reliably than external enemies. Alexander's successors destroyed Macedonia from within. Spain's rigid social hierarchy strangled innovation from within.
The Soviet Union's corrupt system rotted from within. External enemies usually just deliver the final blow to something already dying. And the fifth pattern is that there is always someone new rising. Always. Power in human history is never static. The Dutch rose while Spain fell. Britain rose while the Dutch fell. America rose while Britain fell. The question history keeps asking, and never stops asking, is simply this: who's next?
Dominance is not a destination, it's a moment. Every country that ever stood at the top of the world looked out at the horizon and saw nothing that could touch them. And every single one of them was wrong. That's not pessimism. That's the most consistent lesson history has ever taught us. If you found this video eye-opening, hit that like button, comment, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves history. We'll see you in the next video.